Welcome to Three, a show about Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic, and part of the Tennis Channel podcast network. This is an emergency recording. Obviously, we recorded yesterday with Dr. Lundy to discuss the news that Novak Djokovic had received a medical exemption. Since then, what he has not received is a proper functional visa to enter Australia, as he was stopped at the border, detained for a period of time, and ultimately denied entry. Amy, is there anything key in that timeline that you think should be said about just how this went down?
It's shocking, everything that happened. There are several aspects of it that we can discuss. The main thing here is that the medical exemption did not confer entry into Australia. And that was not made clear to Novak Djokovic. So he got on a plane thinking, with all his rackets and his team and Goran Ivanisevic and his physio, and then he was held and detained for questioning at the airport in Melbourne for about 8 hours, and was ultimately denied entry into the country. As of this recording, he's in a quarantine hotel. There have been reports that he will try to take it to an Australian court, but it's not looking good right now. And the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison of Australia, just tweeted that Djokovic will be leaving Australia.
Yeah. First of all, Joel right now in the middle of a relocation and couldn't join us, unfortunately. So, obviously a time sensitive issue, and we got his okay to go ahead without him. I think the main question, Amy, that needs to be answered right now and hasn't, is the idea that there have been multiple, and I think, again, the word used is a handful of players who have received a medical exemption, the same one that Djokovic received, reviewed by these two medical bodies that were blinded to the applicants. What was different about what just went down with Novak Djokovic from the others that are presumably in Australia that we don't know about, that are there unvaccinated? Why was Novak different?
I don't know the answer to that for sure, but there are a couple of very strong possibilities. Just thinking this through and gaming it out a little bit. Possibility number one, the reason that Djokovic was granted an exemption, it's been reported by multiple reputable websites, including The Age, an independent newspaper in Melbourne, Australia, with sources within the Australian government, that the reason for the medical exemption was recent COVID, which we talked about last night with my brother, the doctor. In other words, in the medical exemption literature, there was an out for people who had had COVID within the last 6 months. And that, according to these media outlets, is what Djokovic was claiming, that he had recontracted COVID within the last 6 months. Perhaps the other people who were granted exemptions weren't claiming recent COVID. Perhaps they had another medical reason, or maybe they were. So that's number one thing that potentially could be different. Number two is the visa status. And this is not a small thing, because I remember 2 years ago when I applied for my visa for Australia, and this is really pre-pandemic. This is January of 2020. So the virus was out there and people knew about it, but we weren't in that pandemic phase of lockdown and that kind of thing yet. So I apply early for my visa for Australia because the deadlines are really strict. And you have to specify why you're going there. Are you going there for work? And yes, if you're going to be receiving money of any kind, which Djokovic would be, That's considered work.
Mhm.
Well, then you have to present other documentation. I understand from listening to Ben Rothenberg on Mike Cation's podcast and Noah Rubin's podcast that this year the visa application process was considerably more stringent, and the deadline, Gill, the deadline for that visa application was early November. So when Djokovic or Eduardo, his agent, or an assistant, or whoever filled out that visa application in early November, filled it out, they wouldn't have known that he was getting a medical exemption because he just received that. So it appears that that person filled out the visa for a person who would have been vaccinated or had vaccination status. That was the rub. That was the problem.
Right.
Other people applying may not have filled out the visa application that way.
Yeah. What I read on the age is that the application, or I guess the visa that was applied for does not qualify for medical exemption, right? That he applied for a type of visa that doesn't fall under the visas that can be exempt medically.
Right. And that
Right.
makes sense because in early November, whoever filled out the visa application wouldn't have known. It wasn't even clear back then what Australia's policies were totally going to be back in like the first week of November. So you can understand where the mistake would have been made or where the confusion would be.
Right. So here's the thing, though. We're talking about an administrative error, right? But this has become something that is like obviously extremely political. The backlash in Australia was considerable to Novak getting this medical exemption. I don't know that that's what Scott Morrison is going to go with when he's pressed on what happened here and why Novak's visa was denied. I don't think he's going to say, well, he applied for the wrong one. Like it was an administrative error, right? Because that's kind of, I mean, that's the kind of thing that, again, I don't know. Maybe that doesn't get figured out easily, but it feels like maybe they'd figure it out if there was an administrative error here.
Well, within that administrative error, there was the problem of recent COVID not being one of the things that you could claim for entry. It was something that you could claim for the medical exemption for the state of Victoria and playing the Australian Open, but for the federal government of Australia, you couldn't necessarily claim recent COVID. Right.
Oh, okay. Because I will say throughout this entire process, the whole federal versus Victoria thing has been really confusing, really hard to grasp, right? Because first of all, they've politically been at odds throughout this entire process, and they've been saying different things the whole time.
And they've flipped. They flipped their positions. Yeah.
Yes. Which is crazy. But I was under the impression that this was the state of Victoria's business and that federally Australia was not going to have anything to do with that. And then that was wrong because the visa was denied federally here. And that's very interesting because that would make sense. Now, the one thing that wouldn't add up then is, again, if there are many players or a handful of players who have received the exemption, you would think that most of them would be in the camp of a recent positive. And I guess that's an assumption, but also we know that statistically it is infinitely more likely that you test positive for COVID-19 than you are going to have an allergy or an acute medical condition that prevents you from taking it. So, I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, let's take Daniil Medvedev, for example. He made the statement in November, it was either late October or early November, in a press conference that he is allergic to an ingredient in the vaccine. Which vaccine he was talking about, I don't know. What allergy, he didn't elaborate, but Medvedev did make that statement. Now, he very short time after, like days later, it came out that the Australian Open would be requiring vaccines. And a couple of days after that, Medvedev tweeted that he was going to Australia. Full stop. I'm going. I'm in. So that resolved very quickly. And I'm not sure if he knew he would be getting a medical exemption or if he decided, I'm just going to get vaccinated. I'm going to, go ahead and get right to the point and get this over with. But if you're somebody who clearly has myocarditis or anaphylaxis or something like that, then I would think you would know ahead of time. But you know what? It does open up the can of worms of did the Australian government target Novak because of the backlash and the political issues? Yeah.
Right, because Morrison stands to gain something politically. It's likely to be a popular move by him to look strong against Novak when people, or I don't know if this was a vast majority or a vocal minority. That's what's hard to say. But regardless, you would see a lot of noise and a lot of Melburnians. Is that the term?
Yeah.
Okay.
Melburnians.
A lot of Melburnians obviously upset, feeling like it's not fair that they are held to such strict standards and someone would be exempt from those very same standards that they had to oblige to because that person might be good at tennis. I totally get that anger. But the point is, politically, there would have been motivation to deny Djokovic's visa.
Yeah. And I think, Gill, that it would have gotten ugly if he were given the rubber stamp to come in after today's drama. I mean, I was sort of playing out the two scenarios in my head while you were sleeping this afternoon because Gill's working overnight on Tennis Channel covering the Australian action. So I was like, okay, scenario one, they let him in. Well, he's going to need like armed security, because there are actually threats online, even on Twitter. There's threats that the public would have been very angry, and the scene at the Australian Open probably would have been pretty bad with booing and who knows what else. So it was going to be sticky to let him in the country and play after the drama has played out the way that it has.
From a PR sense, and I know we talked about this yesterday, Novak's decision to say he was going to say he was receiving a medical exemption, which he didn't need to say, totally didn't need to say, and all of this would have likely been avoided. Or he could have said he was receiving a medical exemption, but then went a step further and say, I'm receiving a medical exemption. Here is why. It feels to me like, and again, Novak's a tennis player. He's not a PR person. So to hold him to a standard that he should be great at these kinds of things is unfair. But it does feel to me like he chose the only thing that was worse or worst for his chances at this shaking up in a way that was going to be good for him.
He's clearly doesn't have the PR machine that Nadal and Federer do, for better or for worse. I mean, in a way that makes him more genuine and more human, that he's always kind of screwing up the PR. But I have kids and I have a daughter, and I'm always working with my daughter in particular on making quicker decisions. Like, don't string stuff out. Be decisive. Yes, you should think about your decision, but don't procrastinate and let things string out. And I think really the right answer, Gill, would have been to be as open as you could all the way back in November. Like, just keep the public generally informed every step of the way, such as, I don't want to get the vaccine. This is why, and I will pursue an exemption, and we'll see what I can do or see what I can get. Or I'm waiting to see if I can get an exemption or whatever. So that way this stew would not have simmered in this pressure cooker with all the secrecy that basically just exploded.
Yeah. And the secrecy lends its way to a lot of just speculation, and a lot of it's really bad. Like a lot of it's stuff that I don't approve of. I know a lot of people don't approve of just guessing about what's going on and how things are playing out. But again, the way to combat that is very, very clear. It's with transparency and communication. That's how to combat speculation. So it's interesting to see, I guess, where they go from here, and not just him, but also the Australian government. But yeah, we'll await to see what Novak says next, right? His fellow players is another interesting angle here, and how they're going to react. Everyone is going to be asked about this, and how might this affect the tournament, and how will players take this, and is there going to be any sort of kind of action united, that the players might stand kind of against this, take some sort of stand. Personally, I never think tennis players are going to unite in anything against anything. So are you with me on that?
I think when you actually talk to a lot of the players, they're more empathetic than you think they are, especially with the people that are on this traveling circus, as they call it. I mean, yes, I know de Minaur and Jamie Murray made some comments. I mean, which I understand, because, like, do you think I wanted to get vaccinated 3 times? No, none of it. Do you think I wanted to be locked down or quarantined the times that I've had to do that? No. But so all of us feel like, come on, man, like, please get on board with us. So I get that sentiment. At the same time, I'm not necessarily for mandates in all situations. So I understand the more libertarian side of it as well. But I do think, generally speaking, the players will empathize or sympathize with what he's gone through. I think the bigger question, though, Gill, is, and you can tell me what you think about this, if there are going to be vaccine mandates going forward, especially at some of the slams like Roland Garros. And a Twitter user tweeted at me just a while ago that France has already said that they're going to have a vaccine mandate, the French government, at least for the short term. So, if Djokovic is stuck on 20, and we know that a goal is to get to 21, where does this leave him?
That's the question. I think that's one of the main things that is interesting about what are future tournaments going to look like. And if indeed Novak had contracted COVID in the last 6 months, and that is the reason for the medical exemption, that's obviously putting a Band-Aid on something that is a broken bone. That's a temporary fix. That was a bad analogy, but you get what I'm saying. That's a temporary fix. So, I mean, I just don't know. I try to resist the urge of getting into his head when it comes to, what would it take for him to get vaccinated? But one thing is clear. I mean, he must feel extremely strongly about not putting these vaccines in his body at this point. The incentive has been pretty high to do it. So the fact that he hasn't shows that it's something that and the fact that he went public and said, I got a medical exemption, that comes from, I want people to know that I'm not vaccinated. Right.
Yeah, as my husband said, it was like a showdown between him and Australia. And yesterday, my husband said, and he won the showdown. Well, I think the showdown wasn't over yet.
Yeah, apparently not.
But look, some people might call it stubbornness not to get the vaccine. It could be called that, but I would argue that it's that very same quality, whether you call it stubbornness or resilience or persistence, that has brought him 20 Grand Slams and made him the champion that he is and made him number one in the world. It's that quality. He just does not back off. So, the story continues.
Story continues. Yep. I mean, the tour got up to around 90% vaccination. So I do think that there's going to be a ton of people who are just kind of falling in the camp of, dude, get vaxxed, and not going much further than that. But look, this is an issue that we know is going to continue to be polarizing. So many angles and layers to it, from where you stand on vaccines to where you stand on Novak Djokovic to what your understanding of the issue is. But all we hope is that you're getting a good picture of what the facts are, what the factors are at play. And I'm sure this will continue to develop. So that'll do it for this episode of 3. Remember, we're available on all podcast platforms. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you're watching on YouTube, like the video, comment, subscribe. We will see you next time on the next episode of 3.